A silent rider buys a mother and child, unaware that she would heal his heart. I ain't sayin' nothin'. Just don't send me back. The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless. It was a wind that knew nothing of forgiveness, a constant scouring force that stripped the land down to its bones of rock and dust. Elias knew that wind. He felt it not just on his skin, a stinging reminder of the biting cold to come, but deep inside him, an echo of the hollowness that had settled in his chest years ago. His homestead was a solitary outpost against the vast, indifferent sky, a small collection of buildings hewn from timber and grit, surrounded by miles of nothing. He liked the nothing. The silence was a blanket, heavy and smothering at times, but familiar. Inside his small cabin, the floorboards creaked under his weight, a lonely conversation with the house he'd built with his own hands for a life that was no longer his. He chopped wood deep into the night, the rhythmic thud of the axe a punishment and a prayer, as if splitting his guilt into pieces small enough to be bearable. On the hill overlooking the cabin, two simple wooden markers stood against the slate evening sky, their edges softened by sun and frost. He never went up there anymore. He didn't need to. The memory was carved into him more permanently than any name on wood. He was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and weathered, with tired eyes that had seen everything and now chose to see very little. He was numb, reclusive, a ghost haunting his own life. The past was a closed door, and he had long since thrown away the key. He didn't know it yet, but the past was riding toward him on the back of a tired horse, seeking shelter in the one place that had none to give. And he remembered a girl, a brief flicker of a memory from a different lifetime. A girl of 16, with eyes too bright for the dusty town they were in, who had looked at him not with the fear or deference most people did, but with a wide-eyed wonder. She'd been bold, for one so young. She'd approached him by the livery, her hands clasped behind her back. "You're the biggest man I've ever seen," she'd said, her voice clear and unafraid. He had only grunted, and used to such directness. She hadn't been deterred. "They say you live alone out on the plains. Aren't you lonely?" He'd finally looked at her then, truly looked, and seen the youthful hope in her face, a hope he had already lost. He'd felt a pang of something protective, something weary. "It's no place for a girl," he'd said, his voice rough from disuse. She just smiled. "I'm not a girl. I'm almost a woman." He'd shaken his head, a slow, sad gesture. "Come back when you're older," he'd said, turning away, the words meant to dismiss but sounding more like a tired prophecy. He hadn't thought of her since, until now. Years later, she did come back, but she was not the bright-eyed girl he remembered. The woman who stood on the dusty street of redemption was named Alara, and the world had worn her down to a quiet, rigid stillness. She held the hand of a small boy, his face smudged with dirt, his eyes wide and watchful. Her own gaze was fixed on the ground, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that went bone deep. She was not broken, not shattered, but exhausted and alert, a survivor who knew the cost of every breath. Her hope had been traded for a fierce, maternal dignity. She was indentured to Silas Blackwood, a man whose wealth was matched only by his cruelty, his heart as barren as the land he owned. He treated her as property, a line item in a ledger, and the town followed his lead. They saw a fallen woman, a burden. They did not see the strength it took to rise each morning, to shield her son from the casual harshness of their world, to endure. Elias rode into redemption for supplies, a journey he made only when necessity clawed at him. The town was a place of noise and judgment, and he avoided it like a plague. He was tying his horse to the hitching post when he saw her. He didn't recognize the face, not at first. He saw only the slump of her shoulders, the way she flinched when Blackwood's voice, slick with contempt, cut through the air. "Worthless?" Blackwood sneered, loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "Can't even mend a shirt right. I'm thinking of selling your contract." "Cut my losses." Alara said nothing. She just pulled her son, Leo, closer, her body a silent shield. A flicker of memory, hot and painful, seared through Elias's numbness. "Fever," A small body he couldn't comfort. A wife's hand growing cold in his. He froze, his hand tight on the leather reins. Blackwood, enjoying his audience, grabbed Alara's arm. Maybe someone here wants to take this piece of damaged goods off my hands. Laughter rippled through the small crowd. And in that moment, Elias saw her face properly as she looked up, a flash of defiance in her exhausted eyes. He knew her then, the girl from the livery, the one he'd told to come back. And she had come back to this. Something inside him, a rusted, dormant gear, ground into motion. He acted against his nature, against the silence he had cultivated for years. He strode forward, his heavy footsteps silencing the mocking whispers. He didn't look at Blackwood. He looked at her. He reached into his coat, pulled out a worn leather pouch, and threw it onto a nearby barrel. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. The clink of metal on wood was louder than any gunshot. Her contract, Elias said, his voice a low rumble. How much? Blackwood was stunned. Then his eyes narrowed with greed. He named a price that was nothing short of theft. Elias didn't flinch. He just nodded toward the pouch. Take it, and leave her be. The transaction was swift and silent. He hadn't bought a person. He had bought a debt. He had bought her freedom. He turned to Alara, who stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. She saw not a savior, but another owner, a bigger, more silent version of the man who had just sold her. He simply gestured with his head toward his wagon. She hesitated, then clutched Leo's hand and walked toward it, her back ramrod straight. As she climbed onto the hard wooden seat, she spoke for the first time, her voice a raw whisper aimed at the dusty floorboards. I ain't saying nothing. Just don't send me back. The journey to his homestead was made in a silence as vast and profound as the landscape around them. The clinking of the harness, the creak of the wagon wheels, the soft sigh of the wind. These were the only sounds that passed between them. Elias kept his eyes on the horizon, his jaw set. He could feel her fear radiating from the other side of the wagon bench. A palpable thing, sharp and cold. She sat rigidly, one arm wrapped around her son, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep against her side. She was a bundle of tense wires, expecting a blow, a harsh word, a demand. He offered none of it. He didn't know what to offer. This act, this impulsive purchase of a life, was so far beyond the narrow confines of his existence that he didn't know what to do next. He had simply reacted to a ghost, to the memory of a woman and child he had failed to protect. Now, two living, breathing strangers were his responsibility, and the weight of it settled on his already weary shoulders. When they finally arrived, the last of the pale winter sun was bleeding away, leaving the sky a bruised purple. The cabin stood dark and solitary. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney of a smaller structure nearby, a rough sod house built into the earth. He pulled the wagon to a halt. The silence pressed in. He got down, his movements deliberate and slow, and came around to her side. She flinched as he approached, pulling Leo tighter. He stopped a few feet away, careful not to crowd her. He pointed a long arm toward the sod house. You can stay there, he said. The words were plain, unadorned. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement of fact. He helped her down, his large hand barely touching her elbow, and she recoiled as if from a hot iron. He said nothing, just turned and began to unhitch the horses. She watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the deepening dusk. Then, taking her sleeping child into her arms, she walked to the sod house and disappeared inside, the worn wooden door closing with a soft, final click. And so their life began. It was a life of separation, of two orbits that circled the same sun but never touched. He lived in his cabin. She and the boy lived in the soddy. Every morning, before the sun was up, he would leave a small pile of firewood by her door, along with whatever supplies he could spare. A sack of flour, a few potatoes, a slab of salted pork. He never knocked. He never waited for thanks. He would just leave the items and retreat into his own world of work and silence. He saw them sometimes from a distance, He watched her hang laundry on a line strung between two saplings, the worn fabric flapping like prayer flags in the constant wind. He watched the small boy, Leo, chase dust devils in the yard, a small, vibrant spot of life in the monochrome landscape. He heard the boy's laughter once, a sound so alien in that quiet place that he stopped his work. His axe held mid-swing, a strange ache spreading through his chest. Alara, for her part, remained a fortress of suspicion. This man's kindness was a language she no longer understood. Kindness always came with a price, a debt to be paid in ways she was no longer willing to pay. So she kept to herself. She cooked their meager meals over her small stove, the metal clinking on tin a lonely sound. She scrubbed their clothes, patched their thin blankets, and created a small, fiercely protected world for her son within the earthen walls of the soddy. She did not speak to the silent giant who had bought her. She did not look at him. She simply endured, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the bill to come due. Their days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons, a silent dance of proximity and distance. It was a life of routine, a few words. The silence was felt, a living presence between the two small buildings. He chopped wood. She fetched water. The vast sky watched them both. He started to notice the details, small things, cracks in the armor of her resilience. He saw the way she favored her left foot and realized, when he caught a glimpse of her shoes left outside the soddy door one evening, that the sole was worn clean through. The leather was cracked and brittle, offering no protection from the frosty ground. That night, long after the smoky lamp in her window had gone out, he moved with a quietness that belied his size. He crept to her doorstep, his footsteps silent in the dust, and took the worn-out shoes. Back in his cabin, by the low light of his own lamp, he worked. His large, calloused hands, so used to the brute force of an axe or a shovel, were surprisingly deft. He found a good piece of leather he'd been saving, cut a new sole, and painstakingly stitched it to the shoe with a heavy needle and waxed thread. He rubbed tallow into the cracked leather to soften and waterproof it. He worked until his eyes burned from the strain, until the job was done. Before the first hint of dawn, he placed the mended shoes back where he had found them. He retreated, watching from the shadow of his cabin as the sun rose. He saw her door open. He saw her bend down, her movements stiff from the cold. She picked up the shoes, her hand freezing in midair. She turned them over, saw the new, solid sole, the dark, conditioned leather. She stood there for a long time, just holding the shoes, her head bowed. She didn't look toward his cabin. She didn't acknowledge him at all. But when she walked to the well later that morning, her limp was gone. Another week passed. The air grew colder, the wind carrying the sharp promise of a deep freeze. He saw Leo playing outside, his small hands red and raw. The boy's coat was thin, his blanket likely just as worn. Elias felt that old, familiar ache again, the phantom limb of fatherhood. He couldn't offer a coat. That would be too direct, a gesture she would surely reject. But he could offer warmth. He had a store of good, seasoned pine in his barn, wood he'd been saving. That evening he began to carve. He worked in the barn, the rhythmic scrape of his knife the only sound. He was not a craftsman, but his hands knew wood. He was carving a cradle, solid and deep, with high sides to keep out the drafts. He sanded the inside until the wood was as smooth as river stone, with no chance of a splinter for tender skin. Took him 3 nights. When it was finished, he carried it in the pre-dawn darkness and left it by her door, next to the morning stack of firewood. He didn't stay to watch this time. The gesture felt too large, too intimate. Later that day, from the far end of his property where he was mending a fence line, he saw it. The cradle was gone from her doorstep. And that evening, for the first time, the smoke rising from her chimney seemed a little thicker, the light from her window a little warmer. She still didn't speak to him, but a fragile thread, thin as spider silk, was beginning to form in the space between them. A connection built of mended shoes and a wooden cradle, of small, secret interventions. It was a language of gestures, the only one they both seemed to understand. He didn't know it yet, but he was slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding the home he thought he had lost forever, one silent act of kindness at a time. The blizzard arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was a sheet of dull, gray metal. The next, it was a swirling vortex of white. The wind howled, a living thing, a distant howl that became a scream against the corners of the cabin. It clawed at the roof and rattled the windows, piling snow in deep, impassable drifts. Elias was inside, stoking the stove, the warmth a small bastion against the storm's fury. He was not worried for himself. He had enough wood, enough food. His cabin was solid, built to withstand the worst this land could throw at it. But his thoughts kept drifting across the 100 yards of raging snow to the sod house. It was sturdy in its own way, built into the earth, but it was small, and he knew the cold could seep through its walls like a ghost. He found himself listening, straining to hear something over the roar of the wind. A cry, a call, anything. Days blurred into a whiteout. He kept his fire roaring, the light a lonely beacon in the storm. On the third night, the wind finally began to subside, its scream softening to a mournful moan. The silence that followed was heavy, muffled by the thick blanket of snow. And in that silence he heard it, a frantic, desperate sound, a knocking on his wooden door. He threw the door open, and a blast of frigid air and swirling snow rushed in. There stood Alara, a specter in the storm. She was covered in snow, her face raw from the wind, her eyes wide with terror. In her arms, wrapped in a thin blanket, was Leo. A terrible, rattling cough tore from the boy's small frame, a sound that cut through Elias like a knife. "He's burning," she gasped, the words ripped from her by the cold and her fear. "He can't breathe right without a word." Elias stepped back, holding the door wide. He ushered her into the solid warmth of his home. He took the boy from her arms, his touch surprisingly gentle. Leo was limp, his skin hot and dry to the touch. Elias's heart clenched. He knew this fever. He knew this cough. He had fought this battle once before and lost. A cold dread washed over him, but he pushed it down, replaced by a grim, focused determination. He would not lose again. He laid Leo on his own cot by the stove, piling blankets over him. He moved with a purpose Alara had never seen, his silent, brooding nature replaced by a calm, deliberate efficiency. He barked a quiet order. "More water on the stove. Keep it boiling. The steam will help his breathing." Alara, dazed and trembling, obeyed without question. Fear had stripped away her suspicion, leaving only a raw, desperate need. She watched as he crushed herbs from a leather pouch, herbs he'd gathered in the fall, and mixed them with hot water, creating a pungent, steaming brew. He gently lifted Leo's head and coaxed the boy to drink, his deep voice a soft, soothing rumble. For 2 days and 2 nights they were a team. They existed in the small, warm space of the cabin, a world unto themselves, snowed in and bound together by a shared purpose. The silence between them changed. It was no longer a wall of distrust but a shared vigil, a space filled with the sounds of a boy's labored breathing, the crackling of the fire, and the soft clink of a tin cup. Elias barely slept. He sat by the cot, placing cool, damp cloths on Leo's forehead, listening to his lungs, his large frame a protective shadow. Alara watched him, a slow, dawning realization taking root in her heart. This was not the act of a man who saw her as property. This was the act of a man who knew loss. She saw the deep, concealed pain in his eyes as he cared for her son, and she understood that his silence wasn't emptiness, but a space filled with ghosts. On the third morning, the fever broke. Leo's breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. The storm outside had passed, leaving the world pristine and quiet under a blanket of white. Alara sank into a chair, the tension draining from her body, leaving her weak with relief. She looked at Elias, who stood by the window, staring out at the snow-covered land. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. He didn't turn, but he nodded. "He's a strong boy," A long silence settled between them, comfortable and deep. She finally asked the question that had been hovering in the air for days. "You've done this before." He remained still for a moment, his shoulders weary. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I had a daughter. Lily." He said the name as if it were a fragile, precious thing. He didn't say more. He didn't have to. The two weathered markers on the hill now had a name. A wall inside Alara. A wall she had built brick by brick to protect herself, crumbled to dust. The thaw came slowly, first as a trickle, then a steady drip, and finally as a rush of melting snow that turned the dusty earth to thick mud. The world, which had been white and silent, was now filled with the sound of returning life. The journey back to town for supplies was a necessity they both understood without discussion. This time, however, things were different. She didn't ride in the back of the wagon like cargo. She sat on the bench beside him. Leo, now fully recovered and cherubic, sat between them, a small, warm bridge in the space that had once been a chasm. The silence was still there, but it was an easy, shared quiet now, punctuated by Leo's occasional questions about a hawk circling overhead or a rabbit darting into the brush. Redemption was just as harsh and judgmental as they had left it. Eyes followed them as they moved from the general store to the smithy. Whispers slithered behind them like snakes in the dust. They saw Elias, the silent giant from the plains, and the woman he had bought, and they drew their own sordid conclusions. Alara kept her head high, her dignity a shield she had polished and reclaimed. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a mother whose child had been saved, and she owed her gratitude and a strange, burgeoning loyalty to the quiet man beside her. Silas Blackwood was waiting for them. He had been nursing his wounded pride, his fury simmering. Seeing them together, looking for all the world like a family, was a lit match to his fuse. He blocked their path as they were loading their wagon, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying to the onlookers who were beginning to gather. "Look what the hermit dragged back to town. Getting good use out of your purchase? Are you, Elias?" Elias ignored him, calmly lifting a sack of flour into the wagon bed. This only enraged Blackwood further. He turned his venom on Alara. "I bet he works you hard. A woman like you is used to it, I suppose. Tell me, how much does he charge the other lonely men out on the plains for a turn?" The words were a physical blow. Alara flinched, her face draining of color. She lowered her gaze, the shame not her own but forced upon her, a bitter pill. She pulled Leo behind her, shielding him from the ugliness. The crowd snickered. It was a public humiliation, a stripping away of her fragile, newfound peace. And then Elias moved. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned from the wagon and stepped forward, placing his massive, solid body directly between Alara and Blackwood. He was a mountain. He was an immovable object. He looked down at Blackwood, and for the first time, the deadness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, protective fire. The crowd fell silent. Blackwood took an involuntary step back. Elias spoke, and his voice, though quiet, cut through the midday air with absolute authority. It was a public declaration. "She's with me," he paused, letting the words sink in, letting them land on every listening ear. Then he added two more, and they changed everything. "Not bought. Chosen." The words hung in the stunned silence. Chosen. It was a word of value, of dignity, of respect. It was the opposite of every label that had ever been thrown at her. Alara looked up, her eyes swimming with tears she refused to let fall. They were not tears of shame, but of shock, of a gratitude so profound it stole her breath. Blackwood sputtered, his face red with fury and humiliation, but he had no response. He had been disarmed, not by a threat, but by a simple, powerful truth. Elias reached back without looking, his hand finding Alara's arm. His touch was firm, steady. He gently guided her and Leo around the sputtering Blackwood and helped them onto the wagon. He climbed up beside them, took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, set the horses in motion. He didn't look back. As the wagon rolled out of town, leaving the silent crowd and the fuming land barren behind. Alara finally let the tears come. They streamed down her face, silent and cleansing. He stayed. He had stayed and stood for her. Something had broken open between them, and the pieces were rearranging themselves into something that looked startlingly like hope. They returned to the homestead as the sun began its slow descent, painting the vast sky in strokes of orange and deep violet. The air was cool and clean. The confrontation in town had left an invisible charge in the air between them, a new awareness. The old boundaries of caution and distrust had been publicly demolished, and they were left standing in the rubble, unsure of what to build in their place. After the evening meal, a meal they now shared at the rough-hewn table in his cabin, Elias went out to the porch. Alara watched him go. Then, after settling a sleeping Leo in the cot that was now permanently by the stove, she followed. She found him sitting on the top step, his large frame silhouetted against the fading light. The wind whispered through the dry grass, a soft, lonely sound. She sat on the other end of the step, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was different again. It was expectant, waiting. The dam of years of unspoken pain had been cracked, and now the water was pressing against it, seeking release. It was she who spoke first, her voice soft in the dusk. "No one's ever done that for me before," she said, not looking at him. "Stood up for me." He didn't answer right away. He just stared out at the plains, at the coming night. "He was wrong," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. She took a breath. It was time for her own confession, for the truth of the girl he once knew to meet the woman she had become. "I was foolish," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "After I saw you, after you left town all those years ago, another man came through. He had easy words and pretty promises. He promised me a life away from that place, a home. I believed him." She paused, swallowing the bitterness of the memory. "He left me in a town 2 states over. Left me with a child on the way and a pile of debts he'd signed my name to. One of them was to a man who did business with Blackwood. That's how I ended up back in Redemption. Indentured. Trapped." She finished her story, and the silence that followed was heavy with it. She had laid her shame and her history at his feet, expecting judgment, or perhaps pity. Instead, he just listened. He listened with a stillness that was not empty, but full of understanding. He finally turned his head and looked at her, his tired eyes holding a deep, shared sorrow. Then he lifted a hand and pointed toward the small, dark shapes on the hill. "My wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Lily." He spoke the names again, and this time they were not just a statement of fact, but the beginning of a story. "It was a fever. Came on fast. I thought I was strong enough to fix anything. I'd built this place with my own 2 hands. I could face down a storm, a wolf, anything the land threw at me. But I couldn't fight that." His voice grew thick with a guilt that was still raw, still bleeding. "I rode for a doctor, but the snow was too deep. By the time I got back, it was too late." Lily went first. Sarah held on for another day. He looked down at his own large, capable hands, as if they had personally betrayed him. "I buried them myself, right up there. After that," the silence just moved in. "Felt right. I figured I deserved it." Alara finally understood. The reclusive life, the profound silence, the haunted look in his eyes. The way he had cared for Leo, with a desperate, practiced tenderness. His impulsive act in town. It wasn't about her, not really. It was about them. It was about the family he had lost. A chance to do for her and Leo what he hadn't been able to do for his own. It was a quiet, desperate act of redemption. The space between them on the step no longer felt like a distance. It felt like a sacred ground of shared grief. She slowly, hesitantly, reached out her hand and placed it on his forearm. His muscles tensed for a second, then relaxed under her touch. It was a simple gesture. Connection. Her skin on his. It was not a gesture of pity, but of communion. Said, "I see your pain. I understand your guilt. You are not alone in it." He did not pull away. He simply sat there, allowing the first touch of human comfort he had felt in years. And on the porch of a lonely cabin, under a sky full of distant stars, two solitary souls, weathered by hardship and loss, finally found they were no longer alone. Spring arrived in earnest, not as a gentle guest but as a determined force, pushing green shoots through the hard-packed earth and coaxing buds from the skeletal branches of the cottonwoods by the creek. The biting wind softened into a warm breeze, and the slate evening sky was replaced by hues of soft pink and gold. The land was thawing, and so were the two people who lived upon it. The confession on the porch had changed the very air they breathed. The silence was now a comfortable blanket, woven with threads of understanding. Words were still sparse, but they were no longer needed for the most important things. A look, a nod, a shared glance over Leo's head as he chased a butterfly. These became their language. They began to work together. It happened naturally, without discussion. One morning, he was tilling a patch of earth for a garden, and she came out with a spade and started working beside him, breaking up the clumps of dirt. They planted seeds side by side, their hands moving in a synchronized rhythm of labor and hope. He taught her how to mend a fence post, and she showed him which wild greens were good for a stew. Their lives, once separate orbits, had merged into a single, steady rotation. Leo's laughter, once a rare and startling sound, became the homestead's new heartbeat. He followed Elias everywhere, his small shadow trailing the large one. Elias would carve him small animals from scraps of wood or let him help by carrying a single nail. He would lift the boy onto his broad shoulders, and Leo would squeal with delight, his small hands tangled in Elias's thick hair. In these moments, Alara would watch them, a gentle, unsteady warmth growing in her chest. She was witnessing a man slowly, cautiously, coming back to life. One afternoon, while Alara was inside, Elias went to the sod house. He gathered her few meager belongings, a worn dress, a tarnished silver locket, a small stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. He carried them to the main cabin and placed them in the empty drawers of a dresser that had stood untouched for years. He took the cradle he had made and placed it permanently beside the main hearth. When she came back inside, she saw her things. She looked at the open drawer, then at him. He was standing by the stove, his back to her, pretending to be busy. It was not a question. It was a statement. This is your home now. She didn't say thank you. The words felt too small. Instead, she walked over to the dresser, opened another drawer, and began to put her things away, claiming her space, her life, her home. Their days settled into a new kind of routine, one of shared existence. They were building something more than a garden or a mended fence. They were building a family from the broken pieces of their pasts. The narrator, watching from a place beyond time, could see the shape of their future. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him. It wasn't the cabin he had built with his hands. It was the warmth that now filled it, the quiet dignity of the woman who shared it, and the bright laughter of the child who had healed it. The two graves on the hill were no longer just a monument to his failure, but a testament to a love that had made this new love possible. An entire year turned. Summer came, hot and dry, and they worked the garden, their skin browning under the dusty sun. They harvested their crops together, their hands brushing as they reached for the same ripe tomato, a small electric touch that spoke volumes. Autumn followed, painting the plains in shades of gold and rust. They prepared for the coming winter, not as two separate souls bracing for isolation, but as a unit, a partnership. The woodpile grew high, the larder was stocked, the cabin was chinked and sealed against the cold. They were ready. They were a fortress. Through it all, a deep and quiet affection grew between them. It was not a love of passionate declarations or grand gestures. It was a love built on reliability, on the quiet, unobtrusive certainty that the other person would be there. It was in the way he brought her a tin cup of coffee in the morning, just as she liked it. It was in the way she mended a tear in his shirt before he even noticed it was there. It was in the shared glance across a dinner table, a silent acknowledgement of the peace they had found in this most unlikely of places. Love grows where no one looks. In the silence between chores, in the warmth of a shared fire, in the trust built one splintered log at a time. It doesn't announce itself with thunder. It arrives with the quiet persistence of grass growing through hard-packed earth. In the long, cold evenings, as winter settled its white blanket over the land once more, Elias began a new project. After Leo was asleep in his cradle by the fire, Elias would take a large, beautiful piece of oak he'd been saving and begin to carve. He worked slowly, deliberately, his knife peeling away long, fragrant curls of wood. Alara would sit nearby, mending or reading, the scrape of his blade a soothing, rhythmic counterpoint to the howling wind outside. She never asked what he was making. She knew this was his way of speaking, of putting his feelings into a tangible form. He was carving a rocking chair. It was large and solid, like him, with a wide seat and smooth, curved arms. He worked on it for weeks, sanding every surface until it was as soft as worn leather, his calloused fingers testing for any roughness, any imperfection. He was pouring all the unspoken words, all the gratitude, all the deep, tender emotion he felt, into the grain of the wood. It was more than a piece of furniture. It was a promise. It was an anchor. It was a throne for the queen of his quiet kingdom. He was building a place for her to rest. He was carving the shape of the word family. He finished the rocker on a crisp, clear morning when the sun made the snow-covered world sparkle. He carried it inside and placed it in the best spot in the cabin, near the warmth of the stove but close enough to the window to catch the morning light. He ran a hand over the high, smooth back one last time, then stepped away. He didn't say a word. He just went about his morning chores, leaving the chair to speak for itself. Alara came in from fetching water, her cheeks pink from the frosty air. She stopped dead in the doorway, her eyes falling on the chair. It stood there, solid and beautiful, a silent declaration. It was big enough for her and Leo to sit in together. She put down her buckets and walked slowly towards it, as if approaching a sacred object. She ran her hand over the curved arm, feeling the warmth of the wood, the care that had gone into every inch of its creation. She could feel his heart in it. She turned and looked at him. He was standing by the open window, looking out at the land, his broad shoulders filling the frame. He was watching the sun rise over their home. She sat down in the rocker, a soft sigh escaping her lips. It fit her perfectly. She pulled a blanket over her lap and gently pushed off with her foot, the chair beginning a slow, soothing rhythm on the creaking floorboards. She picked up Leo, who had just awoken, and settled him into her lap, his warm, sleepy body molding against hers. The chair held them both, secure and strong. Elias turned from the window, and their eyes met across the room. The morning sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air between them. In his gaze, she saw it all. The years of pain, the slow healing, the quiet hope, and a love as solid and reliable as the chair she was sitting in. He finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear in the still morning air. Stay here. It was not a command. It was not a question. It was a plea, an offering, the summary of everything he could not say. It meant, be my family. Be my home. Let me be yours. She stopped rocking. She looked at the man who had saved her, the man she had grown to love, the father her son adored. She gave him a single, deliberate nod, her eyes shining. We'll stay, she said. A home had been built not of wood and nails, but of mended shoes, a shared vigil and a quiet choice. It was a home built where silence meant love. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. In the vast, empty spaces of the land and the soul, they found not loneliness, but a place to plant roots. Their story is a testament to the quiet dignity of the survivor and the redemptive power of a single, unexpected act of kindness, proving that the most profound connections are often forged without a single word. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Remember that strength is not always loud, that love can be a silent offering, and that even the most broken hearts can be mended, not by grand gestures, but by the steady, patient work of building a life together, one shared morning at a time. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most. We'll see you again, where silence means home.